Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Castro here. Let's take a look at chapter 11 of the American pageant. A lot of it has to do with Jefferson's presidency, so let's take a look at some of these things. So the one of the things that we need to make sure that we understand is that we went from essentially a monarchy to a temporary government, which was a loose confederation of states with the Articles of Confederation, to a need for a stronger federal government that was controlled by a federalist government, which basically meant that we had a strong federal government, right, or central government running things because we needed something like that to transition into. One of the things that we begin to see, though, is by the election of 1800, we begin to see that the Federalists began losing a little bit of their clout, and so people wanted something different. There was a little bit of a split within the Federalist Party in terms of who sided with Adams and who did not. So one of the things that we'll see is again in the election of 1800, Jefferson and Adams will run against each other again. One of the things that the election of 1800 is also very famous for, though, is it's very famous for the fact that there was a lot of mudslinging. And by mudslinging, it just means like throwing mud at each other, right? So a lot of negative campaigning. And so a lot of the Federalists were talking smack about the Anti-Federalists, and the Anti-Federalists were talking smack about the Federalists, right? So very personal things, especially in terms of what they said about people like Jefferson. Bringing up the idea that he possibly was sleeping with a slave, amongst other things. So one of the things that happens is that Jefferson actually beats Adams 73-65, largely because of New York. So New York actually ended up voting for Jefferson. And a part of why is because one of the people from New York who was competing, had been competing a lot with Alexander Hamilton, both from New York, from the state of New York, is an anti-federalist, a very staunch anti-federalist by the name of Aaron Burr. And so Aaron Burr actually held a special influence in the state of New York, and he was able to get the state of New York to vote for Thomas Jefferson. So one of the things that had been decided prior to the election was that that Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were going to run, and what they were hoping was that they would create a situation in which Jefferson would become the president as an anti-federalist, and that Aaron Burr would become the vice president because he would get the second amount of votes. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that they ended up getting the exact same amount of votes, and as a result, there was a tie, and so both had gotten 73 votes. So what the Anti-Federalists were hoping, right, was of course that Aaron Burr would simply say, "All right, cool. Well, Jefferson, you're president because that was the deal." But Burr didn't. He was like, "Well, I obviously got the same amount, so I deserve to be president too." So nothing like this had ever happened before, and so the election went to the House of Representatives. And the reason it went to the House of Representatives is because that actually made sense. Being that the House of Representatives was elected directly by the people, the representatives of the people should choose the president. So the House was still controlled by a lot of the Federalists who were still there. They initially preferred Burr, but Alexander Hamilton was actually able to convince a lot of them to vote for Jefferson. And the way that Hamilton looked at it was he basically felt like Jefferson could actually be better controlled, or that he was actually more of a moderate in terms of politics than Aaron Burr was. Now, one of the things that we'll see is, like I said, is that Jefferson becomes the president, and so Jefferson is the president, and Aaron Burr is the vice president. And one of the things that we'll see is that it's considered a revolution. So it's called the Revolution of 1800, and the reason why it's called the Revolution of 1800 is because there was a peaceful transition from one group of people in power to another, right? Where like in Europe, right, there had been a history of like every time there was a switch of power, it was probably pretty bloody. But in this case, it was showing, right, that a peaceful transition from one group to another was possible. So Adams was to be the last Federalist president because eventually the party did fade, and we'll look at that a little bit later. Federal political and financial leaders had built a solid foundation, though, right? So we did owe a lot to those Federalists. The Federalist diplomats had signed good treaties with England, Spain, France, and kept the United States out of war, although we had a quasi-war. The Federalists preserved democratic gains while fending off anarchy, right? So the halfway house between European past and the American future. And so essentially, right, they were a good transition from the monarchy to the type of democracy that we have today. So by the 1800s, the Federalists were unable to appeal to the common people, right? Because again, they were not, they did not believe necessarily that the common people or that the commoner, right, could actually govern. They believed that the best people should govern. So Jefferson integrated democratic principles into his presidency, including walking, his casual dress. He set the precedent of sending messages to Congress to be read rather than speaking himself. Jefferson dismissed few federal appointments. There was very little patronage. So one of the things that the Federalists feared was that when Jefferson took over, that he was going to come in and there was going to be this incredible revolution, right? He was going to throw people out and he was going to just fire all kinds of Federalists and get rid of all kinds of Federalist programs, right? And he didn't. And the reason he didn't is because some of the Federalists that were in power, whether it be in cabinet or whatever, right, they were doing a good job. And some of the Federalist programs were working, so Jefferson didn't get rid of a lot of it, right? And again, that's also revolutionary. And again, he did not commit a lot of patronage. So patronage basically means that it's political spoils. So the idea of the spoils system, and what that means is that when you win, because you are in power, you essentially you can because you're in power, you can choose some of the people to be in power who helped you get elected. So one of the things that we see in terms of Jefferson, though, is he did pardon a lot of the people that were convicted under the Sedition Act. He reduced the residency requirement for citizenship from 14 years to 5 years. Repealed the hated excise tax, which again, the Whiskey Rebellion, right? Jefferson showed restraint by leaving most of the federal programs and Federalist programs in place. He did not go after the tariff, the bank, or the idea of funding a par or assumption because it had helped. It was working. So he helped the idea of the two-party system by showing that defeat for the Federalists didn't mean disaster. So because of the big fear that the Federalists had in terms of the anti-Federalists coming in and making drastic changes, is that the anti-Federalists, or excuse me, the Federalists decided that they were going to pass new legislation called the Judiciary Act of 1801. And what they were going to do was they were going to increase the size of the judicial branch so that they could appoint more Federalist judges, because again, they were concerned that if a bunch of anti-Federalists came in, they were going to come in and try to make drastic changes. And so they were hoping that if they at least controlled the judicial branch, they'd be able to restrain a little bit of what the anti-Federalists were going to do. So they passed the Judiciary Act of 1801 to try to pack the court with more Federalist judges. And so this is known as the midnight judges, right? Because they tried to get them in before the new anti-Federalist president, Thomas Jefferson, and a lot of the new anti-Federalist congressmen took over. So the new Republican Congress repealed it, or Democratic Republicans, which eliminated 16 of the judges. They also tried to target Chief Justice John Marshall, who was appointed in the last days of Adams' presidency, but he remained in office. So Marshall became committed Federalist, and the reason why is because he served at Valley Forge and he saw the consequences of not having a strong federal government to support the military. And so this idea, so he actually came to dominate the court for 34 years. So even after the Federalist Party had died out, he was still in power. So one of the things that will end up happening is a very important case, probably the most important Supreme Court case in the history of the United States Supreme Court. Marbury versus Madison will result in the appointment of William Marbury. So William Marbury was actually selected by John Adams, but John Adams' presidency had expired, and so his appointment had not gone through. So the way that it used to work was any type of appointment that the president made, so if the president nominated, I should say, anybody, the Secretary of State's job, one of the jobs that the Secretary of State was supposed to do, was to take the nominations over to Congress for Congress's approval. Well, since John Adams was no longer the president, the new Secretary of State, and it says on here John Madison, right? So it'd say James Madison. But the new Secretary of State decided that he was not going to take William Marbury's nomination to Congress because he said, well, he's no longer the president, so we don't have to do that. And so he didn't. And so one of the things that happened was because essentially he was robbing William Marbury of his job, he decided that he was going to sue. So he did. So he sued for his job because he said that the Secretary of State didn't walk it over. And so he was trying to force the court to force Madison to hand over his nomination. So Marshall dismissed the suit, but in doing so had struck down part of the Judiciary Act of 1799. So this court case, Marbury versus Madison, which we will look at a little bit closer in class, establishes the principle of judicial review. And so the idea that not the states or anybody else, but the Supreme Court had final say when it came to constitutionality. So in terms of foreign policy, Jefferson did a few things. He reduced the size of the Army and Navy because he distrusted large standing armies. The previous Federalist administrations had been trying to protect what was happening in North Africa. The pirates of North Africa had been attacking our ships. And so one of the things that happened was in 1801, the Pasha, so the person who was in charge of Tripoli, was not happy with his share of the money that he was making. So he kind of informally declared war on the United States. So Jefferson reluctantly dispatched the Navy and secured a peace with the North African pirates for essentially a $60,000 ransom for some of the sailors. Then, foreign policy-wise, things got really heated for Jefferson. In 1800, Napoleon secretly convinced Spain to cede numerous amounts of Louisiana region to France, and so he essentially forces them, right? The first indication of the agreement came when the Spanish at New Orleans withdrew rights of deposit from the Americans. The pioneers wanted to take New Orleans by force, but would mean war with Spain and France. They could have taken Louisiana from Spain at any time, but Napoleon and France were too strong. Would need some sort of an alliance, maybe with England. So, because of the pressure from the frontiersmen, Jefferson sent 2 envoys to Napoleon to try to buy New Orleans for about $10 million. If the sale failed, they were instructed to try to seek an alliance with England so that they could try to get it. At the same time, Napoleon decided that he was going to sell all of Louisiana and abandon his hopes of a New World Empire. His first reason was that he was having, there was a revolution that was taking place in Santo Domingo. It was being led by a former slave by the name of Toussaint L'Ouverture. So the second reason was Napoleon was ending the conflict with Britain, afraid he would have to cede Louisiana to them. By selling, he could get money, not to force U.S.-British alliance, and strengthen the U.S. to someday thwart England in the New World. So the envoy to Louisiana, he was able to negotiate all of Louisiana, not just New Orleans, but all of Louisiana for $15 million. Jefferson was shocked. He wanted Louisiana and land lease, but got that plus all the land west. But the thing is that it became a huge struggle for Jefferson in terms of the constitutionality. So for Jefferson, he being an anti-federalist, right, he was a staunch believer that you had to strictly follow what it said in the Constitution. And so in the Constitution, it did not give permission for Jefferson to do what he was doing and to enter Louisiana. And so he struggled with this idea of breaking the Constitution, which kind of proves Hamilton right in terms of how he felt about Jefferson. So Jefferson purchased the purchase doubled the size of the United States. It avoided conflict with France and an alliance with Great Britain. In the spring of 1804, Jefferson sent personal secretary Lewis and Clark to explore the area. So, of course, the Lewis and Clark expeditions. The exploration yielded maps, knowledge of natives, the overland trails to the Pacific. Louisiana Purchase also boasted national unity, loyalty in the West. And one of the things that happened that we'll talk a little bit about in class is that Aaron Burr actually tried to get part of the West to actually cede from the United States because he was so upset with the United States. And we'll talk about the killing of Alexander Hamilton. So Jefferson was reelected in 1804, 162 to 14, but the new European conflicts threatened success for U.S. trade. Napoleon renewed war with England, and so as a result of his renewed war with England, one of the things that happened was that France and England, they started blockading their waters again, and similar to what had happened after the French Revolution. And so one of the things that we see is that the United States was again under threat by both France and England. So Napoleon ordered the seizing of all merchant ships that entered British ports, again, like they had done so before. And so the British, in similar fashion to what had happened in 1709, began to seize and impress ships, along with continuing to thwart what was happening with the frontier Indians. So the U.S. was not ready for war, so Jefferson was pissed, but he did not want to declare war. The Europeans depended on the U.S. for raw materials and foodstuff, so Jefferson figured that the way to put pressure on the Europeans was to stop the war, was to actually conduct what's called an embargo. So Jefferson decided that the United States was not going to trade until both France and England began to behave, and so he placed an embargo on the world in 1807 called the Embargo Act. So the economies of the North, South, and West were devastated because Jefferson anticipated that both England and France, because of the economic pressures, would actually give in, but they didn't. And so because we relied so heavily, especially in the trade with England, it actually hurt our economies. Now, the irony is that the northern states will begin, as a result of this, will begin to have to manufacture even more goods, which is going to play a very important role in them becoming more industrial, which again is not what Jefferson wanted. Eventually, Congress repealed the embargo in 1809, but still restricted trade with England and France in what was called the 1809 Non-Intercourse Acts. So Jefferson admitted that the embargo was 3 times more costly than had he gone to war. However, it did result in the revival of New England manufacturing, like I said, so indirectly. By 1812, pinched England finally suspended the orders, and so the embargo had actually worked, but obviously too late. So Jefferson retained popularity despite the embargo. He did not want to run for a third term. He called the presidency the worst 8 years of his life. He actually encouraged the election of Madison. So in 1808, when Madison was elected, he could not lead the party. He was not Jefferson. So in 1810, Congress passed what was called Macon's Bill Number 2. So what Congress basically said was that if either England or France stopped what they were doing in terms of the blockade and impressment, that either England or France, so let's say France decided they were going to stop, that the United States would open trade again with that country. And what they would hope that would happen is that the other country would actually give in also. So Napoleon, recognizing this, decided that he was going to negotiate a peace with the United States. And so Napoleon decided to negotiate a peace. But the reality is that he was a lot smarter than Madison, and so he actually outsmarted him, because what Napoleon basically did was he duped Madison into signing sort of an allegiance with him, knowing that England was not going to do the same. And so it put the United States in a very interesting position, because they will sign a treaty with France, essentially a peace treaty, which pisses off England, and it's going to lead England to do even more impressing and to actually give even more weapons to the natives along the frontier. So when the new Congress was elected, there was a lot of young anti-Federalists who were very mad at the Federalists and at England because of what was going on. And so they began calling on war. And these guys became known as war hawks. And one of the people that actually was in charge of the war hawks was the young congressman from Kentucky by the name of Henry Clay, who became the Speaker of the House, and who was essentially the person in charge of the House of Representatives, and he will become very powerful. So the Warhawks wanted strong America to protect the rights of the sailors, to show the world that democratic government was viable. The Western Warhawks also wanted to wipe out the renewed Indian threat along the frontier, which again, England was pushing on the Americans. So one of the things that happens is the Indians along the Mississippi, led by Tecumseh and his brother, nicknamed the Prophet, formed a union of tribes east of the Mississippi. And they basically they decreed that Indians should not give up lands unless all Indians agreed to it, and so therefore they had a right to protect those lands. And so in 1811, war will begin between the with the Mississippi Confederacy and the United States government. And two men, one of them William Henry Harrison, and Andrew Jackson, will actually help defeat the Mississippi Indians, making both men heroes, and of course they will also fight in the War of 1812. So, as a result of the Indian threat being gone, there was a lot of space along the Ohio River Valley, right, for the um, Americans to be able to move into. And so, one of the things that we see is that the country wanted to grow. And so, a lot of these Democratic Republicans or Anti Federalists also figured, you know what, since we were able to defeat the Indians here and the English were doing what they were doing, we should actually push into Canada and invade Canada and take Canada so the English are out of here once and for all. So, June of 1812, the Warhawks in Congress engineered a declaration of war with England because of the impressment and because of what they were doing. And so the War of 1812 will begin where the Westerners and the Southerners were in favor of this war because most of them were Democratic Republicans. But Northerners, most of them being Federalists, were against the war. And this is going to be really important. So the question was for Mr. Madison's war, why did we go to war with England and not France? And again, the answer is because of impressment and because of the arming of the Indians. Unfortunately, Congress was not aware that London had actually repealed the trade restrictions 2 days prior to the war declaration, but by then it was too late. So New England opposed the war because the profits with England's trade were still good. Impressment, what they said, was exaggerated. The traditional federal alignment with Great Britain, and they did not want the addition of Canada to give agrarian states more power because they figured that if they got Canada, which were farming states, they would actually get more of the agricultural states to have more power in Congress. So the U.S. went to war with the most powerful nation, but they were divided. They didn't have a strong army and navy. And so it's going to be a really critical war in terms of the United States. And we were not ready for it. Again, this is called Mr. Madison's War, but in chapter 12, we'll take a look at more of the war itself.